All right. Well, thanks, Mikkel, for uh, letting me know more about your guys' program too, and thanks for inviting me to chat today. Um, this was a very broad topic for me, so I hope that the information I provide to folks is useful and not too repetitive from things you might already know in the area. I'm trying to cover like a very broad range of what rangeland restoration means here in the Southwest, and then also try to provide some resources that folks might not know about for trying to get restoration projects on private lands or tribal lands that folks are interested in doing and implementing. So this can be super casual. So if folks have questions, feel free to interrupt. Again, I very broad umbrella. So if there's other more specific questions, I hope that we have time afterwards to just have more of a conversation. All righty. Uh-oh, need to go forward. So just a little bit about myself. I am very new here. I just got to Las Cruces in January, and I have started a position as a rangeland restoration ecologist professor, assistant professor at NMSU, which I'm really excited about. I've worked in arid lands for the last 15 years, pretty much since the time I finished undergraduate. And really, I like to think that restoration found me, not the other way around. I was always interested in the natural world. I grew up hanging out on my grandparents' farm in Poland, and was always interested in the natural world, but I was really frustrated by well, at that point, my lack of understanding of how we could apply knowledge of the natural world to managing it and actually to restoring and repairing some of the damage that we have caused as humans over, especially the last 200 to 400 years. And so after undergraduate, started working in seasonal jobs as a botanist for the Bureau of Land Management, and then Colorado Parks and Wildlife, and then some nonprofits across the Western United States in Oregon, Idaho, and Colorado mostly, and fell into restoration. I was doing restoration projects of restoring riparian areas on the Oregon-Idaho border and planting trees along them, trying to get those areas on a path of recovery because they had been degraded. There's a lot of gullies forming. Some of the areas were overgrazed. There was also resource extraction in the area, lots of weedy species, and we started to restore them. And only at that moment did I learn that there was a science of restoration ecology and a practice associated with that science that folks have actually been doing for a very, very long time. So the practice is actually much older than the science, which I think is pretty neat. And after those summers, was ready to try to pursue this for the rest of my life. Went to grad school, focused on restoration in the context of rangelands and invasive species. After grad school, completed a few postdocs at University of Arizona, University of Wyoming, and then also in Germany, and then started here. So just got here in January with my partner and our brand new baby, and we are very quickly learning about the desert, and I am very quickly learning about how challenging restoration is in these areas, which I am sure folks who are producers know already that sometimes it is hard to get plants to grow or to conserve plants on our landscapes. All righty, I keep losing my mouse. Before I want to get started, I also want to acknowledge that these are the lands I work on, mostly in the arid southwestern United States and throughout the West, are not my ancestral homelands. My family is from Poland, but I just feel very honored to be able to work on in these landscapes and to be able to try to help them on trajectories for long-term sustainability. And I also just want to, again, thank Mikkel for having me on this seminar, because as someone who's really fairly new to Las Cruces and New Mexico, I'm really excited to meet folks in the area who are thinking about conservation and restoration, and really the sustainable future of rangelands in this area. So thanks for having me. Okay, So I got an email forwarded about reseeding on the range. It should be easy, but it's not. And so a lot of this presentation will just be about how that is not easy and what we as restoration ecologists are trying to do to facilitate the recovery of rangeland ecosystems throughout the Western United States. This is just a picture of the Jornada just north of Las Cruces. But the change that we've seen in about a century. So these lands used to be grasslands, and with more and more human impact on these lands, coupled with climate change, coupled with drought, we have seen a lot of our rangelands, which were dominated by grasses, convert to predominantly shrublands. This is what the desert behind my house looks like. This is what my bike ride to school looks like. And this creates really challenging conditions to get native plants to grow, especially native plants that livestock want to eat and also that wildlife want to eat. And often those are very much overlapped. So what is nutritious for wildlife is also nutritious for livestock. And those are the types of species that we really want to reestablish in rangeland ecosystems. So reseeding on the range, it should be easy, right? Unfortunately, it is not, and especially in these novel conditions that we're all experiencing under global climate change. So I probably don't have to show a map like this to folks, but this just highlights the different extents of drought throughout New Mexico as of this week. So the darker red areas are those that are experiencing higher levels of drought, and those with the lighter oranges and yellows are less drought, but there's very, very few regions of the state that are not under drought conditions. And we are in a 30-year drought right now. The state has only once experienced a drought like this before. I think it was something like 70 years ago, but temperatures were cooler. So that means that there was actually more water staying on the landscape than there is today. And so restoration is a really broad encompassing term that has to now be thought of in the context of ongoing climate change, whether it's drought or other stressors that our ecosystems are facing. Those include things like heat waves, occasionally floods, biotic interactions, so things like rodents or critters of different sorts, novel herbivores like the oryx now being in our regions, wildlife like elk, and then also livestock and grazing pressures that we're trying to maintain with our rangelands as well. So with all of these different components interacting, restoration becomes really challenging because never in history have our landscapes experienced this much pressure from all these different components. Invasive species are another one. And then just erosion in general. As we lose plants, we start to lose soil, and soil is the foundation of getting plants to grow. And so we're really starting in really tough conditions when we're trying to get plants reestablished on a landscape that has been damaged, degraded, or destroyed. What I want to talk about today is just really broad umbrellas of which seeds do we want to use in restoration throughout New Mexico and the arid Southwest, and then try to highlight some new approaches, resources, and opportunities that folks might be interested in if they are trying to implement restoration projects on their land. But to start, I just want to share my view of how restoration works in this context of global change and in this context of novel conditions, and how I approach every single restoration project as a researcher and practitioner. So hopefully this video plays. But as a restoration practitioner, I always think of what do I eventually want my community to look like? It's depicted here in a picture. If we were restoring into unstressful conditions that were not in the context of drought, if we didn't have really hungry rabbits or oryx on our landscape, we could expect that quite a few of our species that are in a native seed mix would establish. But That is very, very rarely the case anymore.
Magna, you're cutting in and out.
I am. Okay. I'll try to talk slower, but I'm not sure what else to do. So we are often restoring into areas that are stressed in different ways by abiotic conditions such as drought. And these conditions act like a filter to prevent some of our native species from establishing on these landscapes. We also have biotic filters. So these can be animals or other plants that further hinder our ability to get native plants onto the landscape. So if we have herbivores like prairie dogs or rabbits or oryx, or other critters on the landscape, or if we have invasive species, we're going to have even fewer of our native plants establishing on the landscape. And I like to think of restoration as a way to try to poke holes in these abiotic and biotic filters to get more of those native plants that we want on the landscape established. And specifically plants that are going to fulfill certain functions, whether it's forage production or erosion control or habitat for specific wildlife. So we can start to make selections of our species based on what our core restoration goals are. Do I sound better, Mikhail?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay.
I
All
think
right.
Mikhail got kicked off, so
A bummer. Okay. Thank
yeah.
you.
Uh-huh.
So this will be the only slide pertaining to my specific research that I'm doing here at NMSU. But a big component of my research is trying to figure out which plants can establish in novel conditions. So under these new conditions of drought or heavy grazing pressures, or in really eroded soils that have lost some of their nutrient content. How do we find the species that can establish, or how do we find the populations that can establish? So as areas get drier and hotter, maybe we need to be moving the same species, but individuals from drier and hotter areas into our region so that they have the capacity to be able to establish there. Or we might need to be looking at certain plant characteristics like how deep their roots are and can they access deeper soil moisture to try to facilitate the ability of our plants to establish into these different areas. And so this is a big component of my work, trying to identify the physiological characteristics of plants that allow them to be drought tolerant or invasion resistant. And then another large component of my work is trying to manipulate environments in ways that are going to facilitate native plant establishment. And so if folks want to chat more about this, I could probably talk for days about how we are working on trying to identify native plant materials for the future. And I think and talk a lot about roots because I think in arid ecosystems, roots really drive which plants can establish and which ones can even recover after things like grazing. It all happens below ground. And so a big component of my work is thinking about the below ground structures that allow plants to thrive on the arid landscapes here in the Southwest. Alrighty, but just to get to the first part of the resources and sort of trying to introduce some of the tools that are available to folks who are thinking about restoration in the area. The first question is often, which seeds and species do I use? So it's going to depend. It's going to depend on what the specific site conditions are, what the goals for that landscape are. Are these lands that we're trying to graze livestock on? Are we trying to restore lands for wildlife habitat? Now there are initiatives for folks to restore or conserve lands for carbon sequestration that the government is helping fund in the context of conservation and some of these carbon economies that are starting to develop. So what are the specific restoration goals? Erosion is a really important factor to consider here. We had a really dusty day on Monday, and that is one of the key ecosystem services or goals that folks that I've been chatting with really want us to be thinking about when we think about restoration in these areas where erosion is a really large problem. But of course, we can have lofty goals, but we also need to be able to pay for restoration projects, and we're going to be limited by what native plant materials are available for us to use. And so just some resources for how to pick different seeds. There's a really neat portal that is put together by the University of Arizona Extension agent, Dr. Elise Cornish, who has put together this portal based on different site-specific goals. So you can go to this website. There's a short survey based on the characteristics of your landscape and the goals for that landscape. So do I want to restore for erosion control or forage production or something else? And based on these inputs that you provide to the portal, like what is your average precipitation in an area? What are your goals? What is the latitude and longitude of the area? What is the elevation? It outputs different recommended plants for a restoration project. And this is not New Mexico specific, but it is Arizona and Southwest specific. So a lot of the species that Dr. Gornish has integrated into this tool are also native species to New Mexico. So I think it's a really great resource for a first place to look for what species might I want to include in a revegetation project in my area. And there are goals and hopes of trying to make this available in other states. Utah is developing their own version. Colorado's developing their own version. And I hope that we can start thinking about developing one for New Mexico here soon. Keep losing my cursor. Another tool is this eco-regional revegetation application that's put out by the U.S. Department of Transportation. And so you can highlight a specific area. So I've highlighted here, this is Las Cruces and the Chihuahuan Desert ecosystem. So this is based on a seed zone. It's a fairly large seed zone, but you can click on this area and you can actually get an Excel sheet of different species that occur in the area that are sort of workhorse species for revegetation in the area. They have trees, shrubs, forbs, and grasses. And there's also in the spreadsheet that's provided, are they commercially available or not? Are they for forest or are they for grasslands? So another really great tool for trying to start thinking about which species folks might want to include in restoration projects based on the region that you find yourself in. Another really fantastic resource that takes a little bit of time to sift through, but has tons and tons of really great information, are the Natural Resource Conservation Service, or NRCS, plant guides and plant notes. So I took just a screenshot of sand dropseed, which is a species that is doing fairly well in restoration down here. So as some of our grama species like black grama are starting to struggle under new drier conditions and hotter conditions, sand dropseed is one of those species that's actually starting to thrive and to do really well. And so this is one species that I myself am really interested in studying, and one species that I know folks who are focused on restoration in the area are also sort of promoting as maybe one of these species we need to be considering as we restore arid lands for the futures. The NRCS has really great information on the distribution of different species, if there's any cultivars, so if there's any varieties that have been developed for specific things like drought tolerance or forage production, all of that is going to be available in NRCS plant guides or fact sheets. Other great resources. Again, the NRCS has put together guides for seeding native grasses in the arid Southwest. So you can find this online, and it's a really quick, awesome guide for things to be considering, for some strategies to improve establishment of native grasses on rangelands, including things like mulching, how deep the seeds ought to be planted. the different species that you might want to consider. So that's a really great, I think it's like a 6-page document that starts to outline sort of a starter's guide for restoration in these areas. And then seed companies. So this is Curtis and Curtis Seed, which is, oh, I'm forgetting, it is in the middle section of New Mexico, just like to the north and east of us a little bit, if I remember correctly. But a lot of seed companies will have seed mixes already developed for specific purposes. So this is just a screenshot of their Santa Fe trail seed mix, and there's the different species listed here: Indian rice grass, western wheatgrass, cytosgrama, galleta grass, buffalo grass, alkali Saskatoon, and little bluestem. And so this could be a good source of information for what should I be planting in my pastures, in my on my landscapes for restoration and revegetation in my region. So seed companies often have a ton of information about what to be growing. Already, so we talked about some revegetation goals, the cost. I just want to highlight that availability of seeds is kind of a bottleneck for restoration in the Western United States. So just in 2021, there was a very large 5-year assessment of national native seed needs. And with increasing wildfires, with increasing disturbance across the West, folks have found that as a whole field of restoration in the West, we need 2.4 million pounds of native seeds each year for revegetation projects, and that land management agencies, which manage a huge part of the lands in the West, are not ready to provide that native seed. So there is more demand than there is supply right now, and this is a large component of sort of why restoration is not happening at as large a scales as we need it to be. And also, I think a really great opportunity for trying to develop restoration practice as a whole, and trying to integrate more farmers and more producers maybe in the native seed production chain, and ideally developing small scale operations that are able to provide seeds to specific projects in specific regions. And so one of those is the DNA Native Plant Program, which was, there was a survey done of needs for Navajo Nation native plants as part of this 2021 assessment of native seed needs. And similarly, there was more need than there was supply, but there is initiatives that are already being undertaken to try to increase the supply of native plants and native seeds for Navajo Nation. So I would love to learn more about that program, and I hope to connect with folks from them soon, as soon as the semester ends, so that I can learn more about what folks are already doing in this space. So where to get seeds? If folks don't already know about this, I think this is sort of a critical hub of information in this region, which is the Southwest Seed Partnership. And the goal of this group is to increase the availability of native seeds for restoration in New Mexico and Arizona. This is a branch of the Institute for Applied Ecology, which is a nonprofit based in Oregon. They have an office in Santa Fe, and they're really working to connect individuals interested in restoration, interested in the native seed supply chain, with one another in the Southwest region to try to facilitate the transfer of seeds from the folks who are producing them to the folks that need them on their landscape. They also provide services to try to get people into the production of native seeds if they have lands that they might want to dedicate to native seed grow outs. So yeah, I'm highlighting it here, but it is a bridge between land managers who need appropriate native seeds for restoration and native seed farmers in the region. The demand for the seeds is increasing, but few farmers in New Mexico and Arizona are producing native seed crops, and they're working on trying to build those connections and to fill that market gap, improve supply through research, foundation seed, and then funding the growing of native seeds for different producers. where else can we get seeds? There's a lot of seed companies. So one of the largest ones in the West is Granite Seed. They're based out of Utah. They have a lot of contracts with farmers around the country to grow specific seeds for different regions and different areas. Brambert Seed is based in Texas, so they're a little bit more local and have seeds for the region. And then Southwest Seed is in Dolores, Colorado, so also climatically similar, and they grow quite a bit of the species that are useful here in the Southwest. The NRCS is a fantastic, fantastic resource for information about native plants. They also run the Los Lunas Plant Materials Center, which is the center that tests different sources or populations of seed for production and to try to increase certain varieties that might be adapted to specific soil conditions or might be adapted to really dry conditions, to try to develop those materials and to try to increase them so that they can start to be used at large scales by agencies and also private landowners. So that's in Los Lunas. I also hope to go visit there as soon as the semester ends, but another really great resource for learning more about what is available throughout the state. And again, if folks in your communities might be interested in farming native plant seeds, I would really encourage them to contact the Southwest Seed Partnership because they really try to facilitate some of the hurdles and try to help folks overcome some of the barriers to enter into native seed production. So there are contracts like that the Bureau of Land Management provides for getting native seed production off the ground. They are a little complicated for me to explain, but it's basically trying to take some of the risk off of the farmers or the growers in the first few years to try to get them into this business. And especially because a lot of our native plants are perennial plants, which may take a year or 2 or 3 to produce seeds. So folks understand that that's a risky investment often, and this is an avenue to try to reduce some of that risk for the different producers if they're interested in joining into these efforts. Yes, so a little bit more on partnerships. Also, I've linked a video here with a large operation in the Idaho region with the Shoshone and Paiute tribes where they're growing native plants, and they've been able to obtain funding for a lot of greenhouses for students to help at. And for folks in the community to start to enter this native seed supply chain. So it's a really neat video, but it's like 8 minutes long, so we will not watch it together. So if we are able to obtain seed, how do we get them to grow? So now I'll just like to share a few sort of more novel, first classic approaches, and then a few more novel technologies that we're thinking about as a restoration community for trying to facilitate the establishment of native plants in arid landscapes. So the most classic, 2 really classic approaches are just broadcast seeding and drill seeding. Broadcast seeding is literally just taking seed, putting it out on a landscape, often after a little bit of seed preparation. This is how things like sagebrush and a lot of our sunflower species are seeded because these are really small seeds that don't want to be buried deep into the ground, but rather they do better if they're closer to the surface. There's some advantages and disadvantages to it. It's really great for small areas. It's really great for hard to reach areas. But there's still a little bit of maintenance with trying to get the seed integrated into the soil and to have good seed to soil contact. You often have to compact it a little bit. But this is a really traditional method of getting native plant seeds onto the landscape and sort of a first step to trying to restore areas that have been degraded. Another really classic approach is drill seeding. So these are no-till grass drills. The Bureau of Land Management often has access to these. Some farmers do have access to no-till grass drills as well. What's really key and important is having different boxes available to put different seeds into and then trying to regulate how they're being dispersed onto the land, because different grasses might want to be deeper into the soil or more shallow into the soil. And often we want to stagger the way that we're seeding them on the landscape to reduce competition between the grasses, because we often have fairly competitive grasses in our seed mix, and we want to give the other less competitive grasses a chance too. Forbs tend to be less competitive than grasses too, but often provide good forage and for wildlife and for livestock. So a little bit of experience is great with these, but often a constraint is that there aren't that many people who have these drills to go out onto the landscapes and seed. So if folks in your community do have these, that is really great. And again, the Bureau of Land Management that does a lot of restoration is also a really great resource to try to learn more about how to get this equipment and these seeds onto private lands for restoration projects. And there are consulting companies that will come and do restoration projects for folks as well. So those are the two broadest, most traditional methods, but I do want to highlight some newer approaches too that folks are developing specifically for arid land restoration, understanding that we are working in really challenging conditions where precipitation is often limiting. We can put all the seeds we want on the ground, but if it doesn't rain, or if we don't do what we can with the rain that we do receive, these plants aren't going to grow. And even in the span of 10 years, areas are getting drier and hotter. And so these seeds are having a harder time germinating and establishing. And there's additional pressures from herbivores and sometimes invasive or non-native herbivores like the oryx in our area too. So the first one I want to talk about is seed pelleting. This is, these are structures that are made out of clay, compost, water, sometimes things like coconut coir. Sometimes folks put cayenne pepper in there to try to prevent herbivory of the seeds by different rodents and even by ants. But the idea here is to get the seeds into a pellet that is easily distributed on the landscape. And in this pellet, it ought to be a little bit more protected. So it's not going to blow off of your landscape. It's not going to get eaten as easily. And also, if you put certain amendments into this soil pellet, the goal is to increase the availability of water to those seeds so that they can germinate more easily. And so it also increases the seed to soil contact, because the goal is to have everything that the seed needs in those first few days of life in this pellet, and then to have it dissolve into the landscape for the plants to send their roots down into the soil and to emerge as a seedling that can establish and persist on the landscape. These are also really useful in post-fire landscapes in areas that are tough to get equipment into. They are easier to disperse by hand than getting a drill, for example, into a post-fire area. Another approach is not a new approach. It's actually a traditional approach that indigenous communities in this area had been using for thousands of years, which is the idea of creating catchments on the landscape that are going to catch water, that are going to sort of create little microhabitats in divots or in pits or indentations across the landscape. They'll catch seeds, they'll catch water, and they'll develop a little microhabitat for plant establishment in these areas. And so again, this is a practice that indigenous communities have been using for a really long time, and that's being adopted in restoration practice to try to get native plants established on the landscape. And so there's different approaches to doing this, but broadly they fall into this idea of pitting a landscape or creating divots and hills on the landscape so that there's higher moisture, water runs into the little pockets on the landscape, seeds run into that area. And so there's these little patches of plants that establish, and then they can spread from those patches. This has been really successful in some of the dryland areas that I've worked in. So in the Four Corners region, near Grand Junction and Fruita in Colorado, and a large scale study that was distributed across I think like 10 sites in the Southwest also found that this was really useful in a lot of arid areas for trying to increase seed establishment or plant establishment in restoration projects. The limitation here is that these implements that create these pits across the landscape are not commercially available. So in the projects that I have participated in, there were partnerships with actually oil and gas companies that helped build implements to revegetate in arid areas that were being impacted by oil and gas extraction. So another barrier to overcome, but a really promising technology to continue with in restoration of arid areas. And then soil amendments. So there's a whole bunch of different soil amendments that folks are using to try to improve establishment of plants in rangeland ecosystems. There's these things called super absorbent polymers, which are actually the little crystals that you have in baby diapers. But the goal there is to retain water when it's available and then to try to release it more slowly for the plant to use so that it doesn't run off of a landscape. This has been fairly successful in forest restoration and also in agriculture, but it is less successful. It's often a little less reliable at large scale rangeland restoration projects where we're trying to seed a lot of grasses at a specific time. Mulching is really a useful tool to mulch, whether it's from wood chips or from straw. On a landscape can try to stabilize the soil and retain moisture, and seedlings can often come through the mulch and establish, but they're experiencing a little bit less stressful conditions under the mulch at the soil surface. Biochar is pretty much like what we use to charcoal, but it's also used to improve water retention, as is gypsum as a soil amendment. And then sugar is actually used in restoration to try to suppress weeds. So sugar has a lot of carbon. Weeds often really like nitrogen. So if we can try to reduce nitrogen and increase carbon, we can try to manipulate the ecosystem in a way that's going to hinder our weeds and promote our native species. So a bunch of different soil amendments are also used to varying degrees of success, but this is like an ongoing area of research in my lab and then also in labs across the Western United States. Alrighty, so I want to leave some time for questions, so I'll hurry through this, but I just want to highlight that there are opportunities to fund restoration projects on private lands and a lot of opportunities too to fund projects on indigenous lands. So here's just screenshots of a few opportunities that I found for the region. The Bureau of Land Management has these Good Neighbor Authority grants, which is to promote restoration and watershed health projects on native lands. NRCS Conservation Innovation Grants. I just found the announcement from last year, but hopefully there will be an announcement for this year. But same thing, they support conservation and restoration projects in the area. Then there's NRCS grazing, technical assistance for grazing lands conservation, which is really to connect folks with one another and to learn from one another. So these are to facilitate things like workshops, on-the-hand field, in-person field trips to different areas to learn about conservation and restoration practices. But there's a lot of funding flowing into restoration right now as part of the bipartisan infrastructure law. They have a whole ecosystem restoration program. They have a whole native seed strategy program. And so these are opportunities for trying to get projects funded. And then another opportunity I want to highlight is upcoming conferences and workshops. So I will be involved with all of these hopefully in the next year and will attend all of them. So if folks have questions, please let me know. I'm going to help organize the Society for Ecological Restoration. So that's the SER 11th World Conference. So we'll have folks joining us in Denver from all over the world for a really large restoration conference in 2025, September of 2025. So next year, so it's coming up. But I really hope that we can integrate and highlight and showcase and really center Indigenous perspectives and traditional ecological knowledge at this conference as well. So if folks are interested in being speakers or holding workshops, please connect with me. We just started planning and I'd love to hear from you. The Southwest Seed Partnership also has an annual stakeholder meeting that just passed last month, but that happens annually. The Society of Ecological Restoration has a Southwest chapter, which they have a meeting usually in the fall in New Mexico or another area of the Southwest. And next year, the National Native Seed Conference is going to be in Tucson, so just 4 hours away. And that's where a lot of growers go, a lot of ranchers, a lot of agency individuals, land managers. That's a really fun conference too, especially for folks who are interested in learning about the national native seed supply chain and how to enter that field. And also there's Society for Range Management conferences. I forgot to put that on there to here, but those happen annually as well. And restoration is starting to be a large component of those conferences as well. And the last slide are just more resources. So I'm here at New Mexico State University. I am new, but I am happy to connect with folks and to answer questions. There's also cooperative agents around the state that you can connect with. There's a new forest research center up in Mora that's going to be focused on reforestation. So if you have trees on your landscape or forest, those might be really great folks to connect with too. They're going to be growing trees for the region, and I'm really excited about that center to get going. University of Arizona Cooperative Extension, Elise Gornish is the restoration specialist there. There are not very many extension specialists focused on restoration. There's only 2 that I know of, one in California and one in Arizona. So Elise is a really great resource for information about rangeland restoration in our region as well. The Southwest Seed Partnership, the NRCS overall, great folks to chat with. They do a lot of restoration at large scales in rangelands. The Bureau of Land Management does as well. They're the folks who are doing a lot of the projects in our region. And there's a lot of momentum right now. So the United Nations declared 2020 to 2030 our decade on ecosystem restoration, just acknowledging that we cannot only conserve lands, we have to actually repair lands at this point to get to a place where we can sustain our planet for future generations. So I hope that we can all capitalize on these opportunities. And with that, I hope that we have some time for questions and just general conversation.
Thank you so much, Magda. If you guys have any questions, feel free to unmute yourself. Well, I guess I have one question while someone can think of a question that they may have in mind. Is there a difference, between broadcast? I know you were talking about that earlier. Is that hand broadcast? If so, is there a specific kind of seed that has to go towards broadcasting?
Yeah, I actually took a slide out of my presentation thinking that I was just trying to do a broad overview, but usually smaller seeds are what we want to broadcast. Even if we use a rangeland drill, we might want to put smaller fluffy seeds. So things like sagebrush. I know we don't have that much sagebrush down here, but shrubby species, things from the sunflower family that have like a lot of the chaff or pappus, things that might get caught, small seeds in general, even those spirabolous seeds I talked about, bush muley seeds, things that are small don't do well when they're buried. So those would be great for broadcast seeding, or if you're trying to use a rangeland drill across a large landscape, having those not be buried, but having the little tubes that drop the seeds out, drop them on top of the soil surface, as opposed to like a ½ inch or an inch into the soil surface.
Okay. So maybe flipping a rake over and smoothing out the end lightly. I mean, the plant won't go no deeper than
Yep.
an inch or something like that would be all right.
Yep, and that's what we've done projects where we we drill seed our larger grass species, and then we go in and broadcast on top of them and just rake them in. And sometimes you use like a compactor of different sorts. It's just literally like a bucket of water, or a barrel, and you kind of run that across your landscape to get a little bit of soil compaction. But that is something that I've definitely done in projects.
Okay, and that's kind of done like on a smaller scale, right? Not like something that's big or anything like that.
No, but you can, so that method of drill seeding and broadcast seeding at the same time, you can use that method at really large scales, and you can often get attachments for the drill seeders that go behind the seeding implements and compact the soil just a little bit afterwards, or like chains that sort of drag along and do the same thing that a rake would. So you can do it at large scales too.
Oh, okay. All right, that's pretty interesting. And you said specifically the seeds that are, did you say sunflower or I'm sorry, I forgot that part.
Just, I think that the most general uh statement could be that things that are small and fluffy,
Small and fluffy.
small or fluffy, actually, I should correct myself, small or fluffy should go on top of soil, whereas things that are heavy and larger should go deeper into the soil.
Okay. All right, thank you. If you guys have any questions, feel free to unmute yourself or you can insert your questions in the chat box. Or if you're not thinking of any questions now, but you know, it will pop up later down, like in a couple, like in an hour or something like that, that you just decide to look back on this. We do have Magna's email address located right here on the screen. So if you guys want to email her questions, feel free. So any questions, any people in the
I
chat?
have a question.
Go ahead, Jesse.
Um, Thank you for the presentation. That was really great. First, just a comment. I work for the Genetic Native Plants program, and we'd be happy to have a conversation with you about your research and all that you're doing. Seems like really cool stuff. But my question is, actually, I think you mentioned it within your research, is that you were focused more on differences in roots. And so that's a really interesting concept. And I just wanted to know if do you see differences, like I imagine there are differences in functional groups, like as a grass as opposed to a forb or a shrub. But do you see differences in roots, like within functional groups, like within in grasses, and like how would that relate to, like what exactly would you be looking for in terms of restoration?
Yeah, yep. So roots are, I'm going to say in the last 10 years, are pointing towards being very, very informative for our understanding of which plants are going to be able to survive, especially in the context of drought and in competition with invasive species. And there are traits. So these are morphological or physiological characteristics of plants. So like basically the physiology of the plant determines how well it does in a specific environment. And one trait that has been really important is actually the density of the roots. So basically how dense the roots um, are related to how tolerant that species is of drought. And so we have really interesting species in the Southwest, like bush muley, that has really thin roots that can go out into the soil and explore it and extract water very quickly when there is a precipitation event. But then they're really dense, so they're resistant to drying out, they're resistant to herbivores below ground. And that's a trait or a characteristic that's really that species possesses, and it's pointing to that specific trait or characteristic being really important for its success in these really arid areas. So that is just an example, how quickly roots grow from the seedling stage to the establishment stage. So over the course of the first season is also really important in dryland areas. And that's because often there's more soil moisture a little deeper in the soil profile. And so the ability of those plants to get down into those deeper soil layers is really important for their long-term survival. So those are the kinds of like root traits that I study in my lab. And folks are trying to integrate that kind of information into selecting plants that are going to be useful for rangeland restoration.
Thank you.
Michaela, I got a question.
Yes, go ahead, Dustin.
Yes, thank you for the presentation, Dr. Gabrowski. I had a question. What importance does the warm and cool season grasses play into like restoring the rangeland?
Very important from a lot of different contexts. So historically, we would have warm season grasses and cool season grasses. Like our bootaluas or our black grandmas are our cool season grasses that historically made up a huge component of the vegetation in this area. The cool season grasses tend to be more drought tolerant, but they tend to also be harder to establish. So we're in a tricky spot when we have a degraded landscape because we want those there on the landscape. They're good forage, they're tolerant once they're there, but they're hard to establish. So it becomes a tricky situation of how do we get them established so that they are at that point where they can tolerate these really intense drought periods. But when we see a tiny little Bootalua seedling establishing, it's not tolerant yet. It's only tolerant after that first season. Whereas some of the earlier season grasses, like the wheat grasses, they're faster to germinate. They grow more rapidly. But in the long run, if there's a really persistent or intense drought, they're the ones that are going to suffer more. And so it's a tricky problem. Ideally, we want both in the community. And some approaches that folks use is to get the warm season grasses established first. So to try to like stabilize soil, start to build the soil health, and then try to put in the cooler season grasses. Something I want to think about and potentially research and work with folks to do is to identify areas where there's still some cool season grasses left, so a landscape's not totally degraded, and use different restoration methods, like maybe some of that pitting, or there's other manipulations to the landscape that are not as intense as the pitting I showed, but basically just structures to catch water on a landscape to facilitate natural regeneration of those cool season grasses. Because we also know that in nature, not in a restoration context, but just when we're looking out on the landscape, about only 3% of the plants that we see in a black grandma stand came from seeds. The rest came from tillers. So the grass will send out a little stem that will put down a root, and it spreads in that way. So it's almost like a clonal plant or like an aspen spreading. And so over 90% of the regeneration that we see of those species in nature is from that vegetative reproduction and not from seeds. So I think that we need to think outside of the box a little bit when it comes to restoration, and maybe try to identify areas where there are some black grandma stands left or other cool season grasses, and try to facilitate that natural regeneration a little more so than going in a different way than just going in and putting down seeds and hoping for the best. Sorry, that was a long-winded answer. I hope I answered your question.
Yes, you did. Thank you for that. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dustin, and thank you, Jesse, for your comments and your questions. I do see a chat in the chat box. Dondi, I'd be very interested to know more about how you determine the root characteristics in a lab setting or in the field.
Yeah, so that's really, I mean, I think it's fun. I think I have had students that have ran away after doing it for a summer and never wanted to look at root traits again. But the most standard approach is we collect the seeds in the field. We dig them up, ideally from areas where they're abundant, so we're not harming the population. And we come back to lab and we wash our plants and we look at the roots. And so we have root scanners that we've adopted from folks that use a lot of like film. So it's like really high-end photography scanners to scan these roots and start to get at their characteristics of how they're shaped below ground, things like this density. But a lot of it is just looking at the size of the root, how they're growing through the soil profile, and then weighing them. And we get a lot of these characteristics like root tissue density, how much dry matter is in the roots. That's also related to tolerance. How wide the diameter of the roots is really important for the different ways that plants cope with drought and how well they do as seedlings in restoration contexts. So it's a combination of field work and lab work. And sometimes we do it all in a greenhouse and in lab too. So if we're working with really small plants, I've worked with plants that are as young as 7 days old, because many plants in rangeland settings germinate and then they just fail to establish. They die. There's high mortality in those very first few weeks of life. And so that's a really critical period for improving restoration success. So we've actually just grown them in the greenhouse and studied them at those very early seedling stages, and tried to identify some of the root characteristics of those really young seedlings that let them make it through that first 3 weeks and withstand drought conditions and other stressful conditions in that really critical phase of establishment. So yeah, lab components and field components, but it's a lot of scanning roots in water and then weighing them to get the traits that we want. And I'm going to be working with an undergraduate student and my collaborator here, who's the NMSU's botanist, Sarah Fuentes Serrano, and we're going to be looking at some of the anatomy of the roots too, which folks are finding is really important for plants' abilities to cope with water stress in the soil.
Thank you so much, Magna. I really appreciate it. We already around about that time. If you guys have any questions, we can take one more question. I'll just leave it here for a couple of seconds. Let's see. Nate, thank you so much. Okay, well, with that being
I
said,
have one
we'll
more
go.
question. Sorry.
Okay.
This is Jesse
All right,
again.
Jesse, go ahead.
Really quickly, does anything about root structure affect like tolerance to grazing pressure?
That is a fantastic question. The research I know of is pointing to the dry matter of roots being important for the ability of plants to withstand drought. But I actually think that's related to, like, if you have a lot of not water in your tissues as a plant above ground, you're also going to have a lot of not water in your tissues below ground. So I actually think it's a combination of those two. But there is a lot of research pointing to not specifically root traits, but bud bank traits. So just like we see buds on the branches of trees from which new leaves come out of, below ground, we have those same sorts of buds that put out new tillers, that put out new grass leaves. And those bud banks have their own characteristics. So how long do they survive, even if they're dry? How many are there? How deep below ground are they? When do they respond to precipitation? When do they not respond to precipitation? And characteristics of that bud bank in areas is really important for grazers. And so there's been research that's been done like even 30 years ago that showed that it was bud bank characteristics that were really important. But in the United States, we have very little information on the bud banks of our native grass species. So it's just an area that folks are starting to explore. And I think it's going to be really important for trying to understand like which plants can bounce back from grazing.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for attending our tonight's presentation. I just want to say thank you so much, Magna, for taking the time out of your busy schedule to present this for us tonight. Definitely, you did not leave anything out, so everything was very informative. Thank you for sharing, all the locations that you can purchase your seeds from and how you can get involved in these partnerships. And, after of when you got your seeds and how you can apply them to your range. So really appreciative, and I hope that we come back soon for another presentations. And I do have something in mind, but I'll get in contact with you about that. But thank you so much. And
Awesome. If folks have questions, feel free to reach out.
yeah, excellent. Well, during this Q&A, if all of you were looking at the screen, there is her information, her email. So if you guys want to take that down, feel free. But other than that, we'll go ahead and end tonight's presentation. I do have a poll set up for you guys if you guys would be willing to go ahead and complete that poll for me. I would really appreciate it. Magna, you're more than willing to stay and stick around. We're just going to share a couple of information here with the folks on here that are in the region and are going to be closer, in the Northern District. So just to let you guys know, we do have a sheep shearing workshop this coming Friday on the 19th. And if you're going to be around campus at Dene College, at the South Campus, actually, it will be held at the Senator John Pinto Library Auditorium. We are going to have some sheep that are going to be, we're going to be having demonstrations on. So from proper shearing positions to shearing techniques, your clippers, how to use them, assemble, maintain your equipment, sharpening, and oiling techniques for shears. And also we're going to be talking about sheep breeds that are best in our area and what type of flock management health-wise that you should be looking out for during this time of the season. And if you guys would like to register, that would be much appreciative. That way we can get a head count. Lunch is going to be provided. So the auditorium can only hold so much people. So if you are going to be attending, please scan the QR code there and we will see your registration. We do have next week a lamb and kidding workshop for those of you that are sheep producers around here. And this can go for everyone, basically, wherever you're located in New Mexico. If you are sheep producers and want to know what type of electrolytes that you should be giving to your lambs, what type of colostrum that you should be looking out for, like milk replacers, what they should have in them, what shouldn't be in them, as well as other emergency type equipments that you may want to have on hand in case of emergencies, knock on wood, that you should have on hand and just in case of emergencies. So definitely you want to partake in this, and this is going to be presented by Dr. Eknoff, who's a New Mexico State veterinarian for the New Mexico Livestock Board. So she's going to be doing this presentation. She's very informative, and she's done a presentation for us from last year on sheep and goat vaccination programming. So we're happy to have her back again. So if you guys would like to go ahead and scan that QR code, it's a little bit fuzzy right now. The pixels on this is not really good, so we're sorry about that. But if you guys want to head over to our website, which is here, it's called the nsa.nmsu.edu. Under upcoming events, where you will see right here in this tab, it will show on the right hand side what the program or what the webinar / workshop is being offered for that month. So you'll see the lamb and kidding workshop on here, replacing the bull selection webinar. And it will also say registration is required. We do have to have registration all the time for our webinars, just as, for a reference for